I was standing behind the turning lens at 2 in the morning when the water that should have been empty showed me a boat. Not a memory, not a trick of the light I was holding. An actual boat, a small open coble, riding the black still sea where no boat could float, sitting low on the calm water perhaps 2 cables off the skerries, exactly where the rocks would open a wooden hull like a hand opening a book. And in it were people, sitting, facing the tower. All of them turned toward the light, toward me, their faces impossible to read across the distance, except I could read them. I had that terrible certain knowledge underneath all reason they were looking up at the lantern room, looking up at the window. And they had been looking for longer than a night, longer than a life. They were waiting the way you wait at a door you've knocked on 100 times, knowing someone is inside. The dark came back. 15 seconds. The beam swept round again. The boat was still there. I have spent my life being the sort of man who checks things, who verifies, who does not permit himself to be fooled by his own eyes until he has looked 3 times and checked the facts against some external measure. I stood in that lantern room at 2 in the morning on a calm night in late January, 90 feet above the mouth of a cold sea, and I checked. I looked down at the driving clock on the wall behind me. Honest, the beam was turning at exactly its prescribed rate. 15 seconds from flash to flash, as it had turned for 100 years, as it should turn. I felt the glass of the storm panes in front of me, cold, real. I was awake, and when the beam came round again, to the black water landward and north, the boat was there. The people in it were there, and this time, in the fraction of a second the light touched them, I saw that there were more of them than I had counted the first time, or fewer. I cannot say which, because the shock of seeing them move. They had moved, they were in different positions, had shattered my attention into pieces. The dark, 15 seconds. I stood without breathing. Out to sea the beam swept. Along the coast, round and round. Honest, 15 seconds. The beam came to the black water landward and north. The boat was empty. It rode the calm with no one in it at all. A bare open boat on dark water where no boat could be. I watched it for the next 3 complete sweeps of the light. Empty, empty, empty. On the 4th sweep there was no boat. I stood in the lantern room until the sky went gray. When the tide fell and the spit rose streaming out of the water, and I became once more a man who could walk off an island into the ordinary world, I went down the stairs slowly, my hands shaking in a way I did not yet understand. I went into the cold north office that smelled of paraffin and stone. I sat at the desk, and I understood, sitting there in the gray light with my breath showing, several things all at once. The first was that I hadn't gone mad. The second was that something had come out of the cold water. The third was that I had been sent to this place not because I wanted quiet, but because I was the sort of man who would, when confronted with the impossible, do the one thing no rational person would do. I would try to understand it. I would sit down and begin to reconcile it, the way I had reconciled columns of figures for 40 years, as if a person could balance an account with the dead. But I get ahead of myself. To understand what I saw that night, you need to understand what brought me to that lighthouse. You need to understand the man I was when I came. And you need to understand, most of all, the thing I had failed to do, the failure that carved out the space where the light could reach me. My name is Eversley. The name doesn't matter. What matters is what I did not do, what I failed to do, and what the light, in its terrible patience, spent a whole winter teaching me. I had been married for 30 years to a woman named Marin. We married young, when we both still believed that a marriage was a thing you built once and then simply lived inside the way you live inside a house. We did not understand then that a marriage is a thing that has to be rebuilt every few years from the same broken materials, because the old structure has quietly rotted while you were admiring it. Marin was not an orderly person. I want to say that plainly, because I held her disorder against her as a fault for most of our life together, and it was not a fault. It was the whole of what I loved and could not admit I loved. The way she left a room mid-sentence to look at something out the window. The way her handwriting sloped and ran and abandoned words half-finished because her thought had already leapt ahead. The way she cooked without measuring and it came out right, which offended me at a level I could not reach with reason. I measured everything. I measured flour. I measured feeling. Without ever calling it that, I kept a ledger of our marriage, a running account of what I had given and what I had received. And when the columns did not agree, when I felt I had given more than I had got, I did not say so. Saying so was disorder. Saying so was the kind of scene Marin's family made, and mine never did. So I simply entered the discrepancy in a private ledger and let the resentment accrue at interest. And I called this being a reasonable man. I called her the difficult one. I was wrong on both counts, and it took a lighthouse at the end of the world to teach me. We had a daughter, Ilsa. We did not lose her to death, which people know how to grieve. We lost her to the slow continental drift that a marriage's coldness works on a child. By the time she was grown, she had learned from watching me that love was a thing you kept a careful distance from, a hot stove you did not touch. She moved to Canada and wrote at Christmas. That is its own account and not this one, except that it is the same account. It is the same failure wearing different clothes. The failure was simple. I could not be present to another person. I could witness a column of figures with my whole soul. I could attend to a discrepancy of a penny across 10,000 pounds until my eyes bled. But I could not simply sit with my wife when she was frightened or sad or lonely and be there for her wanting nothing, offering nothing, fixing nothing. I could not be the pair of eyes that registered that she was there and that her being there mattered. When she was frightened, I gave her a plan. When she was sad, I gave her a reason not to be. When she was, in the last years, simply lonely inside our house with me in it, I gave her nothing. Because loneliness has no column. You cannot reconcile it. And a thing I cannot reconcile is a thing I turn away from. The night it ended, not the divorce, which came later and was only paperwork, she was sitting at the kitchen table late. She was crying quietly, the way she had learned to cry in that house, without sound so as not to make a scene. I came in for a glass of water, and I had a choice. The plain animal choice that every marriage comes down to in the end, whether you will cross the room. And I did not cross the room. I stood in the doorway and I asked in a reasonable voice whether she was all right, which is the question you ask precisely in order not to have to know the answer. She said without looking up, "You're going to stand there, aren't you?" Not a question. And I stood there. I got my glass of water and I stood there, and then I went to bed. Something that had been dying for decades finished dying in that kitchen while I ran the tap. We both knew it. Neither of us made a scene. 8 feet. That is all the distance there was between the door and the chair. 8 feet of linoleum I could not cross for the one person who had asked me to for 30 years. I tell you this, not for the confessing of it, though the confessing has been part of what changed, but because you cannot understand what the light asked of me unless you understand that I came to that coast as a man who had spent his whole life failing at the single act of being present to another soul in its trouble. That was my flaw. That was the crack in me that the light found. And I want to be careful here, because the shape these stories always take is that the flaw and the horror lock together like a key in a lock. The anomaly is secretly about the narrator. The drowned water is really his drowned marriage. And I resisted that shape with everything I had, because it is a lie, a flattering lie, the kind of lie a man tells to keep himself the center of a story that was never about him. The drowned of Corran Head were not a metaphor for Marin. They were not sent to teach me a lesson. They had their own deaths, their own cold, their own 180 years of waiting in the dark. They were entirely indifferent to my little marriage and my little guilt. That is the whole point. That is the point I nearly missed. The light did not ask of me what it asked in order to heal me. It asked it because the thing needed doing, and I happened to be the man holding the lamp. The healing came sideways as a byproduct, the way warmth comes off a fire you lit only for the light. But I get ahead of myself again. Let me take this properly. The boat came out that Thursday, as it came every third Thursday, with stores and mail and drums of paraffin. The relief keeper's name was Macaulay. Lewis man, past 60, dry as a stick, pale eyes and the kind of stillness that made you think he was listening to something you couldn't hear. He had been relieving at Corran Head for 30 years. Before that, he had kept lights all around the north and the Isles. There was nothing about the trade he did not know. Corran Head sits at the end of a long spit of dark rock that juts out into a sound 4 miles wide. The tower is 90 feet tall, painted white and gone dull cream with weather. Connected to it by a low stone tunnel, they call it, the Neck, is the keeper's house. A squat 2-story box built to withstand rather than to comfort. There is a store shed. There is a slipway of green concrete going down into water so cold that the first time I put my bare hand in it, testing it the way you test a thing you don't yet respect, the cold went up my arm like a current and stopped my breath in my chest, as if a fist had closed around my heart. I understood in my body before my mind caught up that the sea at Corran Head was not a view. It was a mouth. At high tide, the whole thing becomes an island. The spit drowns. There is no path to anywhere. You are cut off completely for 6 hours while the water runs fast enough to stand up in, standing waves that would capsize any ordinary boat. The nearest lit window belonging to another living human being was 4 miles off across the sound, a farm on the far shore called Ardnamurchan, a single point of warm yellow that came on at dusk and went out around 10. In those first weeks, I looked at that light more than was good for me. I would stand at the seaward window with a mug going cold in my hands and watch it come on, and I would feel it as a kind of company. Then I would feel it go out, and I would feel that as a kind of abandonment. I was ashamed of feeling either a man of 51 attaching himself to a stranger's kitchen bulb 4 miles across cold water. I did not yet know that the whole of the light I stood inside was, in its true and secret purpose, a version of that same longing on a scale I could not imagine. A light kept burning across water for the sake of the ones on the far side of the dark who need to know that someone is home. The work itself was simple, and I loved it at once. That I loved it so quickly should have told me something. I have always been happiest inside a system. And a man happiest inside a system is a man running from something formless. I was running from something, though I could not name it then. The daily order at Corran Head had been laid down by men I never met and refined across a century. It came to me whole. All I had to do was keep it, which is what I do best in the world. In the morning, whatever the weather, I cleaned the lens. The lens was the heart of the place, a great drum of prisms and bullseyes as tall as a man, a French-cut thing from the last century, floating on a bath of mercury so nearly frictionless that the whole enormous apparatus could be set moving with the pressure of one finger. It would turn on through the night, silent, grave, as long as the weight in the driving mechanism kept falling. I cleaned each prism with a chamois and a breath and a particular circular motion the printed instructions specified. I confess that this was the task I loved past reason. Kneeling inside the lens in the cold morning light with the sea going gray to silver outside the storm panes, polishing glass that had been polished every morning for 100 years by men whose names I would never know, I felt, doing it, that I had joined a line, that I was one bead on a string of keepers running back into the dark. I assumed the line ran forward, too. I was wrong about the forward. Then the fuel, then the wicks, then the winding of the weights, then at dusk, the lighting even with the modern burner, a small ceremony I performed with more solemnity than it required. Through the night, the watch, in the morning, the log. The log is where I have to slow down, because the log is where the strangeness lived, and I know exactly how these accounts usually go. I am not going to tell you the logbook wrote itself. I am not going to tell you I found a page in my own hand recording a day I had not yet lived. Nothing so obliging happened to me. What happened is duller. and far worse, because it could not be dismissed as a trick of a machine or a fever of the brain. The Logs lived in the office, a small room off the foot of the tower, cold, north-facing, smelling of paraffin and old paper, and the particular mineral smell of stone that is never quite dry. They were flat green ledgers, dozens of them, stacked in a cupboard with a door that had swelled and had to be persuaded. They ran back further than I had any right to expect. The earliest ones were in copperplate so fine and faded it was like reading frost on a window. And every keeper in every hand, going back as far as the ledgers went, kept 2 counts of the night. There was the shipping. That is the job. That is the whole official reason for the log. Vessels sighted. Their type where you could tell it. Their bearing. The time. Whether they answered the light. A fishing boat, north-northeast, 2 in the morning, standing well off. A coaster, southbound in the shipping lane, 11:30. That column was ordinary. I filled it faithfully. There is nothing to say about it, but underneath the shipping, in a narrow column that the ruled ledger pages did not provide, for every keeper had drawn it in himself, freehand, so that it wandered and wavered down the years as the hands changed. There was a second count. The column had no proper heading. At the top of each new page, where a man might write vessels or remarks, the keeper simply drew a small circle in ink, about the size of a thumbnail, and beneath it, night by night, he wrote a number. Most nights the number was 1, many nights it was 0, now and then it was 2, and rarely 3. Once, deep in a ledger from the 1950s, the hand a heavy square one that pressed hard into the paper, the number was 5. And beside the 5, that keeper had written the only words of commentary I ever found in any of the circle columns across all the years. He had written, "A long night." The ink was gone brown as strong tea. The pen had pressed so hard on the 5 and on those 3 words that it had scored the paper, almost torn it. You could feel the grooves under your fingertip like the ruts of a cart in dried mud. I sat with my finger on that torn 5 for a long time in the cold office and felt the first true breath of the thing come up at me out of the page, though I did not yet understand it, and would not for months. Whatever the circle counted, 5 of it in one night had cost a grown man enough that his pen nearly went through the paper. He had needed, against all of the discipline of the log, to leave a mark that said so. There was no key. No instruction anywhere in the board's printed materials mentioned the circle. No page explained it. And yet every keeper who had ever held the post had kept it, unbroken, night after night, for as long as there had been a light. I am constitutionally incapable of leaving a column empty when every man before me has filled it. So I did the sensible thing. I asked. Macaulay came out on the boat every 3rd week with the stores and the mail and the drums of paraffin. He stayed the night and went back on the morning tide. He was the only living soul I saw for weeks at a stretch. On his second visit, when I had settled enough to have questions, I brought one of the ledgers to the kitchen table where he was cleaning his pipe. I opened it to a page. I put my finger on the little inked circle and its column of 1s and 0s. I asked him plainly what it was. He did not look up from the pipe. He turned it in his fingers and drew the pipe cleaner through the stem and blew through it and held it up to the lamp to check it. Only when all that was done did he say, in a voice with no weight on it at all, "The count." I said I could see it was a count. I asked what it counted. He put the pipe in his teeth unlit, which I learned was a thing he did when he was deciding how much of a true thing to hand you. He looked at me then, and his pale eyes went over my face the way you might go over a chart of a coast you had wrecked on once. He said, "You'll get it." And that was all. He would say no more. He asked whether the store cupboard hinge was still catching, and I said it was, and we talked about the hinge, off-kilter, unhelpful, the way men are when the true answer is too large to fit through the small door of an ordinary conversation. I let it go, because I was a man who believed that any system could be understood by watching it long enough. I assumed the circle was a system. I set myself to watch. Here is what I have to make you understand about the light itself. It is the hinge the entire door swings on. It took me the better part of that first winter to see it. And I resisted seeing it every step of the way, because I am a rational man, a man of columns that agree, and what I am about to describe cannot be true, and is. The light at Corran Head does not sweep the sea evenly. Now I know how that sounds. A lens floating on mercury, driven by a falling weight through a train of gears, turns at one rate and one rate only. It is, in the most literal sense, a clock. It cannot dawdle here and hurry there any more than the hour hand can. And I checked. You must believe that I checked, because I could not have gone on living beside the thing if I had not. I timed the flashes against the winding clock in the office, against a pocket watch, on one absurd night, against my own pulse with 2 fingers on my wrist. The machine was true. 15 seconds every time, all the way round, out to sea and along the coast and over the deep water of the Sound and back. The interval never varied by so much as a breath. The clock was honest. I want that on the record, because everything I'm about to tell you happened in a world where the clock was honest. And that is precisely what makes it unbearable. And yet, standing in the lantern room at night, and I had begun, without deciding to spend my watch not in the warm office below, but up in the cold glass room at the top, behind the turning lens, 90 feet above the mouth of the sea, I began to feel that the beam lingered. Not slower, I have to be exact, or the whole thing collapses into ordinary madness. Not slower on the clock. The clock was honest, but heavier over one particular arc of the dark. Not out to sea where the ships were, where the light was supposed to be looking. Landward and a little north, over a stretch of black water between the head and a cluster of low skerries where no vessel would ever be, could ever be, because the rocks there would open a wooden hull like a hand opening a book. Over that one dead patch of empty sea, in the fraction of the sweep where the beam crossed it, the light seemed to look. That is the only word I have ever found, and I have looked for a better one for 3 years. 15 honest seconds all the way round. And yet as the beam passed over that black nothing landward and north, it seemed to look, to attend, to search, and I, standing behind it with my cold hands on the brass rail, felt with a certainty that grew night by night from a whisper to a shout that I was not the one doing the looking, that I was holding a lamp up for someone else, that the light went out through me and past me and did the searching of its own, and that my part in it, the keeper's part, was not to see, but to hold the lamp steady and be present while something else saw. I told myself it was the loneliness, and I want to be fair to that explanation because it is the sane one and I clung to it as long as I could. The man in the Edinburgh office had warned me the place was not quiet. I decided this was what he meant, that a mind kept too long in its own company begins to lean the world toward meaning, to find faces in stone and intention in the turning of a machine, that I was a lonely man leaning a lighthouse. I had leaned things before. God knows I had spent a marriage leaning the ordinary facts of a shared life into a private system that only I could read. So I did what I always do when the world frightens me. I doubled the order. I trimmed and cleaned and fueled and wound with a ferocity that had nothing to do with the light's actual needs. And in the circle column, out of pure stubbornness, out of the refusal of a costing clerk to enter a figure he cannot vouch for, I wrote 0. 0 and 0 and 0, night after night through the closing dark of the year, while the beam went round and did its slow, heavy looking over the black water landward and north. While something out there, I am now certain, waited, and was not counted, because the man in the lantern room was too frightened of his own eyes to admit what they saw. The first night I wrote one was the night the water was not empty. It was late January, a flat calm, and a flat calm on that coast is worse than a gale. In a gale, the sea is a chaos of noise and motion. The whole tower thrums. Spray goes past the lantern panes 90 feet up. There is no room in a man's attention for anything but the immediate roaring fact of it. It is, perversely, restful. The way any emergency is restful because it empties the mind of everything but itself. But a flat calm is silence with a texture. The sea goes to a gray-black skin, barely breathing. The silence is not empty. It presses on the ears. It has a grain to it. Into that silence the smallest sound comes enormous. The tick of the driving mechanism, the far cry of a bird, the sound of your own blood. And the mind, given nothing to do, begins to attend. And attention, I would learn, is the one thing the place runs on, the one thing it is hungry for. A flat calm is when the place is most awake. It was near 2 in the morning. The tide was full, so the head was an island. The spit drowned. No path to anywhere. I was in the lantern room, not working. There was nothing to work at. The light was lit and turning, just standing behind the lens in the dark, which I had no business doing. A warm office and a bunk waiting below. But I had taken to standing there the way a man takes to a habit that is halfway to a compulsion, telling myself I was keeping watch, knowing I was doing something else I could not name. The beam went round. It swept out to sea, empty. It swept along the coast, empty. And it came to the black water landward and north, and did it slow, heavy-looking, and this time, in the fraction of a second. The beam crossed that dead patch of sea where no boat could be. I saw that the water was not empty. I want to describe this exactly because everything depends on the exactness. It was not a ghost ship. Nothing glowed. There were no lanterns of the dead, no phosphorescent rigging, no cold blue fire. It was a boat, a small open boat, a kobold. The double-ended inshore boat the local men had used 2 generations back and did not use now. Sitting low on the calm water, perhaps 2 cables off the skerries, exactly where the rocks made it impossible, riding still on a sea with no swell to move it. And in it were people. That is what the beam showed me in less than a second, before it swept on, and the dark came back. A boat with people in it, sitting, facing the tower. The dark came back. 15 seconds. I did not breathe for any of them. I stood behind the lens telling myself, in the reasonable voice I had used in the kitchen doorway, that I had seen a rock awash, a raft of eider, a trick of moonlight on the skin of the sea, except there was no moon. The sky was overcast. The only light on that water was the light I was standing behind. 15 seconds. The beam came round again, out to sea, along the coast, and over the black water landward and north. And the boat was there. The people in it were there. And now, in that second of light, I saw that they were not merely facing the tower in the general way a boat faces where it is pointed. They were looking up at it, at me, all of them. The distance was far, far too great for me to have made out any face. I want to grant that. I want to grant every ordinary explanation its due. But I had, all the same, the marrow-deep and total certainty of the kind that arrives underneath the reasoning mind and cannot be argued with because it did not come by argument that they were looking up at the light, and that they had been looking for a very long time, longer than a night, longer than a life, and that they were waiting the way you wait at a door you have knocked on when you know someone is inside. The dark came back, and here is the thing I have never been able to make anyone fully credit, and I have long since stopped trying. I tried to count them. On the second sweep there had seemed to be several, a boatful, 5 or 6, sitting close. On the third sweep, when the beam came round, and I had steeled myself to count, there was one, a single figure sitting alone in the stern, upright, facing the light, not several diminished to one, wholly and simply, as if the several had never been, or as if I had been wrong, except I had not been wrong. I had seen the several as clearly as I now saw the one. On the fourth sweep the boat was empty. It rode the calm with no one in it at all, a bare open boat on black water where no boat could be. And on the fifth sweep there was no boat, and no water that was different from any other water. The beam did its slow, heavy looking over a stretch of sea that had gone back to being merely a stretch of sea. It went on round, out to the empty ocean, indifferent, honest. 15 seconds, turning on its silver blood. I stood in the lantern room until the sky went gray. I did not decide to. I simply could not make my legs take me down the stairs. The watch became a vigil. The vigil became the whole of the small hours. Somewhere in it the terror I had come up with burned down into something else, something I had no name for then, and would spend the winter learning to name. A kind of grief that was not mine, a grief I was standing next to rather than inside of. The way you stand beside a mourner at a graveside whose dead you never knew. When the tide fell and the spit rose gray and streaming out of the water and the head became, once more, a place a man could walk off of into the ordinary world, I went down the stairs. I went into the cold north office that smelled of paraffin and stone. I took down the current ledger and opened it to the day. I sat with the pen a long time. I filled the shipping column first, because the discipline held even then, even shaking. Nothing. No vessels. A flat calm. No traffic. And then I moved the pen to the narrow column under the little inked circle, the column I had filled with stubborn zeros for months. And I understood, sitting there in the gray light with my breath showing, several things at once and all the way down. Things I had in fact known for a long while and only now permitted myself to say. I understood that the circle did not count boats. I understood that it had never counted boats. I understood that what I had watched cross that black water was not a haunting in the sense the word usually means, not a replaying, not a loop, not a dead thing caught in a groove. It had responded to the light. It had waited for it. It had come and been counted and gone in a way that had a shape, an arrival to it, a completion. I understood that the several and the one were not a contradiction, but the truth. That a boat had come carrying more than one, and that of them, on this night, one had been ready, one had crossed, one had arrived, and the rest had drawn back into the dark to wait for another night. And I understood, last and deepest, sitting alone in that cold room, having failed for 30 years to cross 8 feet of my own kitchen, exactly what the count counted, and what the light was for, and why no keeper had ever been able to write it in the board's forms. I wrote in the circle column in a hand steadier than I had any right to, the number 1. And then I put the pen down, and I did a thing I had not done at the kitchen table, had not done at my daughter's leaving, had not done, I think, at any point in my careful reconciled life. I put my face in my hands, alone, with no one to see and nothing to gain and no scene to avoid. And I let the grief that was not mine move through me, and I did not manage it, and I did not reason with it, and I did not turn away from it, and it was the first honest hour I had spent in decades, and it was given to me by a stranger in a boat who had been dead for longer than I had been alive, who had needed, for the length of one sweep of a light, someone in the high room to see her go. I say her. I did not know that first night that it was a her, but the young man in the bow, and the woman in the stern, and the long night of 5, and all the faces I would come to know across that winter, better than I had ever troubled to know the faces of the living. They were coming, one boat at a time, out of the black water landward and north. And I was, God help me and thank God, beginning at last to learn how to look. What I had to learn that winter, and I want to be honest that it was learning, that it did not come naturally, that it went against the whole grain of the man I had been for 51 years, was how to look at another soul without turning the looking into something about myself. It sounds simple. It is the simplest thing in the world. And I could not do it. And I suspect a great many people cannot do it, and go their whole lives never knowing they cannot, because life rarely asks them to in a way that admits no evasion. The light asked it of me in a way that admitted no evasion at all, because a soul crossing that black water could not be given a plan, could not be given a reason, could not be fixed or managed or reconciled, could not be helped in any way whatsoever except the one to be seen going, honestly, the whole way, by a living person who was actually present and actually moved and wanting nothing back. And I found, when I first tried to do it in earnest, that I did not know how, that my attention was a clumsy instrument that kept curving back toward its own center like a compass needle to a hidden magnet. And the magnet was always me. I will show you what I mean with the young man in the bow, because he is the one who taught me, and because I owe him the telling. He began to come in February in the hard middle of the winter, and I knew him at once for a regular the way you come to know a face on a morning train. Before I knew anything about him, I knew the shape of him, the set of his shoulders, the particular forward lean. He was young. That much the beam gave me plainly across all the impossible distance. Young in the way that only the drowned young are young, an unfinished quality to him. And he sat always in the bow of the boat, forward, as if he were the one keeping lookout. And when the boat came, on the nights it came, there were always others in it with him. And he was always turned not toward the light, as the others were, but toward them, toward the other people in the boat, reaching, it looked like, though the beam only ever gave me a second of it, reaching to steady them, to help them, his hands out to the ones behind him. So night after night the light would sweep across the boat and show me the others facing the tower ready to cross, and show me this one young man in the bow with his back half to the light, turned round, tending to the rest. And the beam would move on, and the dark would take them. For 4 nights he did not cross. I counted the boat, and I counted the ones who were ready, and I gave them my attention as best I was learning to. And each of those nights the young man in the bow stayed in the bow, turned to the others, and the count I wrote in the circle was the count of the ones who went, and he was never among them. And I began, in the way of the man I had been, to make him a project, to try to understand him so that I could, in some sense, get him across, resolve him, close his account. I stood in the lantern room and I reasoned about him. I decided he had gone into the water trying to save someone. That was the meaning of the turned back and the reaching hands. He had died a rescuer, and could not now let himself be rescued, could not board the light and arrive while there was anyone still behind him needing help. I built him a whole story, a good and sympathetic story, and I was rather pleased with it. And I stood behind the light offering him my sympathetic story the way I had offered Marin a plan across a kitchen table, and he did not cross. Of course he did not cross. He could not feel my clever, sympathetic story any more than my wife could feel the reasons I gave her not to be sad. A story about a person is a wall you put up so that you do not have to stand in the open weather of simply witnessing them. I had built him a wall and called it understanding, and he stayed in the bow. It was Macaulay who set me right, though he did not know he was doing it. Or perhaps he knew exactly and did it in his sideways Lewis way. He came out on the boat in the 3rd week of February, and by then I had, in the phrase he had used, got the count, and he saw it in me the moment he came up the slip, the way a man who has kept lights all his life can see it. And he did not say anything about it directly, because that is not how the trade speaks of the thing. The trade does not speak of it at all, if it can help it. But that night after the stores were stowed and the paraffin drummed off and we had eaten, he sat at the kitchen table cleaning his pipe as he always did, and he said out of a long silence, not looking at me, "You'll have your regulars by now." I said I had one. I told him about the young man in the bow. I did not tell him my clever story. Some instinct kept me from it. I only told him what I saw. The boy in the bow, turned to the others, reaching, 4 nights, never crossing. And I asked him, and my voice was not steady, what I was doing wrong. Because I was certain by then that I was doing something wrong, that a better keeper would have got the boy across, that this was a failure and failures are mine to own. Macaulay put the pipe in his teeth unlit, the way he did when he was deciding how much of a true thing to hand me. And he looked at me at last with his pale, still eyes, and he said, "You're trying to land him." I said I supposed I was, that surely that was the work. And he shook his head slowly once, and he said the second and last off-kilter thing he ever said to me. The thing I have turned over every day since, and will turn over until I die. The light doesn't land them. The light lets them come. There's a difference, and it's the whole of it. You're not the harbor, man. You're the window with the lamp in it. You don't reach out and haul a soul aboard. You keep the lamp lit and you watch, and you let them do the crossing in their own time. And the ones that aren't ready aren't yours to hurry. Your only job is that not one of them crosses unseen. And then he put the pipe down and said the store cupboard hinge was catching again. And we talked about the hinge, and he never returned to it. And he did not need to, because he had, with those few dry words, torn down the wall I had built around the young man in the bow and shown me the open weather behind it. You're not the harbor. You're the window with the lamp in it. I had spent my whole life trying to be the harbor, trying to be the one who fixed, who landed, who resolved and reconciled and closed the account, and it had made me useless to every person who ever needed me, because what they needed was never a harbor. It was a window with a lamp in it, a sign that someone was home and awake and looking, a light to come toward in their own time and their own way, while they did the hard work of crossing that no one can do for anyone else. Marin had not needed me to solve her sadness. She had needed me to cross the 8 feet and sit down and be the lamp in the window while she felt it. And I had reached for a plan instead, tried to be the harbor, tried to land her, and she had drawn back into the dark like a boat that isn't ready, and waited. And no one had come to the window, and after 30 years she had stopped coming toward the light, because there was no light, only a man in a doorway asking in a reasonable voice whether she was all right so that he would not have to know. I went up that night after Macaulay was asleep, and I stood behind the light with all my clever stories put down, and I did the only thing there was to do, which was nothing, which was everything. I watched. The boat came. The young man was in the bow, turned to the others, reaching, and I did not try to land him. I did not build him a meaning. I simply attended to him, the whole of him. In each second the beam allowed, with my whole self and no story and no wall and nothing wanted back, the way you would keep company with someone at a task that is theirs alone to finish. The way I understood with a grief that doubled me over the brass rail. I had never once kept company with my own wife. I watched him help the others. I watched him steady a woman as she readied herself to face the light. I watched him hand something invisible to a child, and I did not hurry him, and I did not resolve him, and I let him be exactly what he was, a young man who could not arrive while anyone was still behind him, and I honored it, and I stayed at the window with the lamp, and I let him take the time he needed. He crossed on the 7th night. The boat came in a rising wind, the calm broken, spray starting to go past the panes, and the others went first, one by one over the nights, and then the last of them on that 7th night. The woman he had steadied and the child he had handed the invisible thing to. And when the beam swept the boat, and there was no one left in it but him, the young man in the bow turned round. He turned for the first time away from the empty thwarts behind him and toward the light, toward the tower, toward me, and in the 1 second the beam gave me, I saw him face it. And I cannot tell you what was in his face, because he was a mile off across black water, and it was raining, and he had been dead for I never knew how long. But I know what I felt come across that mile, and it wasn't fear, and it wasn't sorrow. It was the particular ease of a man who has finally been let put down a weight he has carried so long he forgot it was a weight. The ease of the last one out of the burning house standing in the street, counting the others safe. And the beam moved on, and the dark came. And the next sweep, the boat was empty, and the next, there was no boat. And I stood in the lantern room in the rising gale and wept like a child, an old man of 51 weeping alone in a glass room 90 feet above a winter sea, unashamed, unmanaged, present. And I went down at dawn, and I wrote in the circle column the number 1. And it was the truest number I have ever written in a life full of numbers. And it was not about me, and that it was not about me was the whole of what he had come to teach. I did not that morning feel healed. I want to be careful about this, because the flattering version of the story would have me mended by then. The drowned young man a kindly ghost sent to fix the broken clerk. And it was not like that. It is never like that. The dead do not exist to repair the living. He had his own crossing to make, and it had nothing to do with me and my marriage and my failures. And if I had made it about those things, I would have failed him the way I failed everyone, would have kept him in the bow another 100 years. What was true was quieter, and I only noticed it weeks later, sideways, the way you notice a wound has stopped hurting, that in learning to be the window with the lamp for the drowned, in practicing on strangers the one act I had never managed with the people I loved, I was becoming, slowly and against my grain, a man who could do it. The healing came in as a byproduct of the work. The way warmth comes off a fire, you lit only for the light, and it would be spring before I understood how much I had changed, and it would take a long night of 5 to prove it, and it would take, in the end, the hardest thing the light ever asked of me, which was not to cross anyone over, but to refuse. But the wind was rising in my winter as it rises now in the telling, and the long night was coming, and I will take it up there. Spring on that coast is not a softening. People who have not wintered in the far north imagine spring as a gentleness arriving, and instead it is a violence of light, the days stretching at both ends with a suddenness that unsettles the body, the sea going from gray-black to a hard, cold blue that is somehow less kind than the gray. Gannets coming back to the skerries in their hundreds and diving all day like flung knives, and the whole world turning up its brightness while the water stays cold enough to kill a man in minutes. I mention the diving gannets because they became, that spring, a small daily torment to my new understanding, for I would watch them go into the sea after fish, folding and dropping and vanishing into the cold. And I would think about the young man in the bow, and about all the ones still waiting in the black water landward and north. And I would understand in a way I had not before that the sea does not distinguish. It takes the gannet and it takes the fisherman and it takes the child off the ferry in 1843 with the same indifference. And the light I stood behind was the one place on all that indifferent coast where the distinction was made, where a human death was held to matter, where someone was posted specifically and only to say, "This one and this one and this one, I saw them. They were not nothing. They arrived." By spring I had my regulars, in Macaulay's word, and I had learned to keep the count as it was meant to be kept, which is to say, I had learned that the count was not the point, but the residue of the point. The mark you make after the real work is done, the real work being the seeing. A 0 in the circle no longer meant to me that no boat had come. It meant most often that a boat had come and no one in it had been ready, that they had ridden the black water facing the light and drawn back into the dark to wait, and a 0 on those nights was not a failure of mine, but a truth honestly recorded. And I wrote it without the old shame. A 1 meant one soul had crossed and been seen, and I came to hold in my mind the way a shepherd holds his flock, the ones who came again and again and did not yet cross, not to hurry them. Macaulay had cured me of that, but to keep faith with them, to be there when they came, so that no soul that finally readied itself to face the light would turn toward it and find the window dark. That was the fear that lived under everything now, and it was not a fear for myself. And this was the measure of how far I had come. My fear was that I might fail them, that I might be asleep or ill or below in the office reconciling the paraffin on the night a soul who had waited 180 years at last turned round to cross, and that they would turn to the light and find no one in the high room seeing them, and would draw back into the cold believing once more that no one was home. That fear is what kept me at the window on the night that has a name in my mind, the long night, the night of 5. And I will tell it now as plainly as I can, because it is the center of everything, and because it is where I first felt, underneath the work, the shape of the choice the light was going to put to me in the end. It was late April, near the turn into May, and there had been a storm 3 days before, a real one, the kind that comes up the sound like something with a grudge. and it had blown itself out and left behind that hard, bright cold and a heavy old swell that went on rolling for days after the wind had gone. Long, smooth hills of water moving through the sound with the tower shuddering faintly as they passed the rock. I have wondered since whether the storm had something to do with it, whether the sea being stirred so deep had loosened something, brought something up, the way a storm turns the graves of the sea and gives back sometimes what it has held. But I do not know, and I have learned not to reach past what I know. So I will only say that the storm had passed and the swell was running, and the night was clear and hard and very bright with stars, because there was no moon. And I went up to the lantern room at dusk with a flask of tea and a sense, which I had learned to trust, that the night would not be an empty one. The first boat came before it was full dark, which had never happened. In that strange doubled light of a northern spring evening, when the sun is down, but the sky is not, and I saw it in the low glow rather than in the beam, a kobold riding the long swell off the skerries, and there were people in it, and I steadied myself, and I took my place behind the lens, and I began to do the work, and I had barely begun with them, had barely settled my attention on the first of them, an old man, sitting very straight amidships, with his hands on his knees like a man in church. When I understood that this was not going to be a night of one boat, because behind the first boat, further out on the black swell, there was a second, and I do not mean I saw it clearly. I mean I felt it the way you feel a room fill up behind you, a pressure of presence, and when the beam next swept the black water landward and north, it showed me in its single second, not one boat, but two, and in them, together, more souls than I had ever seen come in a night, and I knew, with a lurch of the old fear, that they had all come ready, or nearly all, that this was a night when the waiting broke, when a great backlog of the patient dead had somehow all turned toward the light at once, and that I was going to have to see every one of them across, alone, in the high room, and that if my attention failed, if I grew numb, if I let even one of them cross unseen, I would have failed the one thing I was for. I have thought a great deal since about that keeper in the 1950s, the heavy square hand that pressed a 5 into the paper hard enough to tear it and wrote beside it a long night. And I understood him fully for the first time that spring evening, understood the 3 words as the entire testimony of a man who had been asked to do the most this work can ask and had done it, and had needed, against all the discipline of the log, to leave a single human mark that said what it cost. Because here is what the count of 5 does not tell you, what no number can tell you. It is not 5 times the weight of one, it is far more than 5 times. Because the whole difficulty of the work is that it cannot be done in bulk, cannot be done to a crowd, cannot be done by ticking off a tally as they pass. Each soul must be seen singly, wholly, as if that one were the only one, given the entire and undivided attention that the young man in the bow had taught me to give. And to do that 5 times in a night, to empty yourself completely into the seeing of one, and then, when they have crossed, to gather yourself and empty yourself completely again into the next, and again, with no numbing allowed, because numbing is exactly the failure. This work requires you to stay open, wound open, 5 times over, through a whole night, wanting nothing back. It is a labor of a kind I had no name for, and had never performed. The labor of pure sustained presence, and it is the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than any grief. Because grief at least lets you collapse inward, and this work forbids it. This work requires you to stay open. The old man amidships, straight-backed, hands on his knees, was the first to cross, and he was, of all of them, the easiest, if easy is any word for it, because he had been ready a long time and only wanted witnessing, and when the beam swept him and he turned his face up to the light, I gave him my whole self, and he crossed with the simplicity of an old man lying down at the end of a long day, and I felt him go, and I wrote nothing yet, because you do not write during, you write after, but I marked him in the tally I keep in the place a keeper keeps such things, and I turned to the next, The second was a woman with her hands clenched in her lap, and she was angry, and her anger was the anger of the drowned who had waited too long. And I stayed with her anger and did not try to soothe it, and did not try to make it mean something. And I just let her burn with it toward the light, and she crossed burning, and I felt the heat of it. The third was a child, alone, with no one holding it, and the child was terrified, and I wanted to reach out, wanted to comfort, wanted to be the harbor. And instead I stood at the window with the lamp, and I let the child see that someone was looking, and the child shook like a leaf in the wind, but it turned toward the light, and it crossed, and the terror did not stop it crossing. And the fourth of the 5 was a woman with a child, and this is the one I carry. This is the one that is with me now as I speak. Because she would not cross without the child, and the child was not ready. I saw them across many sweeps, the woman holding the child against her, facing the light, ready, so ready, wanting it. And each time the beam came round, she was still there, because she would not go alone, would not arrive without the small one. And the small one clung to her and turned its face away from the light, into her, the way a frightened child hides. Not ready, not ready. And the mother would not leave without it, and could not make it ready, and neither could I. And there was nothing to be done. There is never anything to be done. You cannot land them. You are the window with the lamp. And I stood behind the light, and I did the only thing there was. I witnessed them, the mother's terrible patient love and the child's terror. And I did not hurry them, and I did not build them a story, and I did not try to be the harbor. I only stayed and was the lamp in the window through sweep after sweep of that long night, while 3 others crossed around them. And at last, near the very end, in the graying of the dawn, the child turned. Some readiness that no one could give it and no one could hurry arrived on its own, the way readiness does. And the child lifted its face from its mother's breast and turned it toward the light. And the mother, I have never seen anything like it, and I never will again. The mother did not go first even then. She waited to be sure. She let the child face the light and gather itself. And only when the child was truly ready did she turn her own face up beside it. And they crossed together, mother and child, in the same sweep, in the gray of the dawn. And I saw them wholly. I did not let them cross unseen. And the beam moved on, and the dark that was no longer quite dark took them. And the next sweep, the boats were empty, both of them, riding the long swell off the skerries with no one in them at all. And the sweep after that, there were no boats, and the sun came up out of the sea the color of a struck match. And I was alone in the lantern room, and I was more tired than I have ever been in my life. And I went down, and I opened the ledger, and I wrote in the circle column the number 5, and I did not write any words beside it, because the keeper in the 1950s had already written the only words there were, and I did not need to press them into the paper. I felt them pressed into me, and it was there, in the flattened exhaustion after the long night, that I first felt the shape of the thing I had been avoiding, the question that had been standing behind all this work, like a figure standing behind you in a lit window at night, invisible until the moment the light shifts. I felt it come up in me, quiet and reasonable and terrible, in the voice of the man I used to be, the man in the kitchen doorway. What if you stayed? Not what if you walked down the slipway into the cold and joined them. I had refused that story long ago. It was too much about me, too flattering. The drowned did not want to keep her in their boat. They wanted to keep her in their window. No, the question was worse than that, because it was reasonable, because it wore the clothes of love. The question was, what if you never left? What if, when the board closed the post, as I already knew it meant to, you simply refused to go? What if you made yourself the one thing the light could not do without, the one pair of living eyes on all that indifferent coast? And you stayed at the window with the lamp not for a season or a tour, but for good, for always, until you were old, and then until you were dead. so that not one soul crossing that black water would ever again turn toward the light and find the window dark. What if you gave your whole remaining life to it? Would that not be the finest thing a man could do? Would that not redeem the 8 feet of kitchen linoleum you could not cross? Would that not, at last, make you the harbor? And I stood in the cold office with the ledger open and the 5 drying on the page, and I felt how nearly the light had me, and I did not yet know that this reasonable, loving, self-annihilating temptation to stay forever was the real trap the place set, the one every keeper faced in the end, the one Macaulay had been steering me away from all along without ever once naming it, because to name it is to make it stronger. I only felt it that morning as a pull, sweet and total, toward giving myself up entirely to the work I had come to love. And I will tell you next how I learned what that pull truly was, and who it was that had stayed, and the choice I finally made in the last of the light. I did not act on the pull that spring or that summer because the pull was patient, and because a temptation that wears the clothes of love does not need to hurry. It only needs to be there, warm and reasonable, every time you are tired. And I was tired often. But it changed the way I moved through the days. I began, without admitting it to myself, to make the light my whole life in a way that went beyond the work. I let my letters to my daughter go unanswered longer. I stopped watching the far window at Ardnamurach come on at dusk, because it no longer comforted me. It accused me. It was a window with a lamp in it belonging to living people leading a living life. And I had begun to prefer the other windows, the ones that came out of the black water, the dead who needed me so purely and asked nothing back and could not disappoint me and could not be disappointed by me. And I did not see, for a long time, that this preference was the oldest sickness I had. Wearing a new and holy-looking coat, I had always found it easier to attend to what could not answer. A column of figures, a dead stranger in a boat. It was the living, the ones who could look back, who could need me untidily and at the wrong times and in ways I could not reconcile, that I had never been able to face. And here was the light offering me a whole eternity of the easy kind of love, the love of the dead who only receive, and calling it duty, and I nearly took it, and I would have taken it, I think, if I had not found the room at the top. I found it in September, a year almost to the day after I had come, and I found it because a slate came off the tower in a gale, and I went up to see the damage, higher than I usually went, up past the lantern room to the little space under the very cap of the tower, a triangular dark loft full of the smell of tar and old iron and pigeon, where the ventilation cowl came down and the spare parts were kept in wooden crates gone soft with damp. And in there, wedged behind a crate, wrapped in oilcloth against the wet, I found a book. Not a board ledger, a private thing, a fat old commonplace book bound in cracked black leather. And when I opened it in the light of my torch, I saw at once that it was not one man's book, but many men's, that it had been passed down, keeper to keeper, hand to hand. Going back, I checked the earliest date, and my breath stopped going back nearly to the building of the light. It was the book the tray did not speak of. It was the thing behind the little inked circle. It was what no keeper would ever put in the board's forms, written down, after all, in secret, in the dark loft, for the one who came after. I read it over 3 nights, and I will not pretend to give you all of it, because much of it was the ordinary matter of keepers, weather and repairs, and the small feuds of the boat. But threaded all through it, in dozens of hands across the generations, was the true account of the light, and it told me 3 things, and the third of them is the one that saved me. The first thing it told me was that everything I had worked out for myself was true, and it eased me to read it in other hands, to know I was not mad, to see a keeper in 1911 describe the beam that seemed to look, and a keeper in 1937 write of learning that you cannot land them, and a keeper whose hand I recognized the heavy square hand write at greater length about the long nights and about the discipline of seeing each soul singly, and to feel across all those years the same labor I had been doing, the same grief, the same fierce protective love of strangers, so that the book was, more than anything, a company, the company of every man who had ever stood where I stood. And I wept over it too, because I had joined a line after all, exactly as I had felt on my knees inside the lens that first morning. And the line was real, and I was in it. The second thing it told me was the history the board's records did not keep, the true tally of the sound. The 1843 ferry, 43 souls, before there was a light, and how the keepers who came after understood that the light had been built too late for those 43, and had spent decades seeing them across, a few a year, the great slow backlog of the uncounted dead, and how there were still, when the Black Book's last hand wrote, a handful of the 1843 souls uncrossed, still coming, still waiting. And I thought of the mother and the child in the long night, and wondered if they had been among the last of the ferry, 80 years drowned and could not know. And it did not matter, because knowing would only have been another story I built to make it about me and the fishermen, generation on generation, and the wrecks, and the ones who simply went into the sound in sorrow, and how the count in the little circle was the residue of a labor of witness that had been going on unbroken, night after night, for a century and more, keeper handing to keeper the charge of seeing the drowned of that coast home. It was the most beautiful and terrible thing I had ever read, and it made the pull to stay forever rise up in me stronger than ever. Because how could you leave a work like that? How could you hand a thing so sacred to a stranger? How could you not give it your whole life and your death besides? And then I came to the third thing, and the third thing was written in several hands, always the same warning, always urgent. The ink often pressed hard the way the 5 had been pressed hard. And the third thing was this, that the light does not only take the drowned, that the light is hungry, in its way, not cruelly, not with malice, but the way any deep and holy work is hungry, and that what it hungers for is the keeper. That every keeper, in the end, feels the pull to stay, the reasonable, loving, self-annihilating pull to give himself entirely to the work, to make himself the one indispensable pair of living eyes, to never leave, and that this pull is not virtue and is not duty, though it wears their clothes exactly, but is the light drawing the keeper down, toward becoming what he watches, that the keepers who stayed did not become saints of witness. They became the thing in the boat. They crossed the black water not down the slipway, but slowly, over years from the window, their whole living attention pouring out into the dead until there was nothing left of them for the living, until they had stopped answering the letters and stopped watching the far warm window, and stopped being able to love anyone who could love them back, until at last they were only a pair of eyes at the glass, and then not even that. And then a boat came for them, and a new keeper came out on the Thursday boat and found the post empty, and the ledger's last entry an ordinary one and no explanation, and in time felt the beam begin to look. And it began again. The Black Book named them, page after page of keepers who had stayed too long and given too much and been taken, not as a punishment. The book was clear on this, not as a punishment, but as the natural end of a man who has learned to love only the dead. And the warning in every hand that gave it was the same. And it was Macaulay's warning made plain at last. The trick of it is not to count yourself. Do the work, see them across. But keep one window in your heart turned toward the living, toward the far warm light across the water, toward the daughter who writes at Christmas, toward the world that can look back at you and need you untidily and disappoint you and be disappointed, because the day you close that window, the day you decide that the pure, easy love of the dead is enough and the living are too hard, that is the day you have begun your own crossing, and no one will see you go. because the keeper's whole terror and whole glory is that there is no keeper for the keeper. I closed the black book in the dark loft under the cap of the tower with the tar smell around me and the sea going below, and I sat there a long time, and I understood that I had been, for months, doing exactly what the book warned against. I had been closing the living window. I had preferred the dead because they were easy. I had called it duty, and it was the oldest cowardice I owned, the same cowardice that had kept me in the kitchen doorway, dressed now in the robes of a sacred vocation, but underneath the very same refusal to face a love that could look back. And I understood, with a cold that went up my arm and stopped my breath like the sea, that if I stayed, if I refused the board, if I made myself the indispensable eyes, if I gave the light my whole remaining life as I had been aching to do it, would not be the finest thing a man could do. It would be the last and largest instance of the only sin I had ever really committed. It would be me, once more and forever, choosing the love that asks nothing over the love that asks everything, and calling it virtue, and dying of it, unseen. And yet, here is the thing. Here is why it took a whole further year and nearly took me altogether. The work was real. The drowned were real. The mother and the child were real. And the young man in the bow. And the 43 of 1843 still coming a few a year out of the black water. And they did need a living pair of eyes. And the post was closing. And after me there might be no one. And the machine would flash its honest 15 seconds forever and see nothing. And the drowned would turn toward the light and find the window dark for good. That was true. That was not the light's hunger talking. That was simply true. So the choice the light finally put to me was not the easy choice between a temptation and a duty. It was the cruelest choice there is, the choice between two loves. And I had to find a way to serve the dead without dying of them. To keep the window with the lamp lit for the drowned without closing the window in my heart that faced the living. And I did not know if such a way existed. But I will tell you, in the last of it, what I found. The board's letter came in the new year, formal and kind, thanking me for my service and informing me that Corran Head would be automated in full, and the resident keeper's post discontinued as of the autumn. The boat to take me off for the last time in October. I read it at the kitchen table with the sea gray in the window, and I felt three things in the same breath. And I have learned to trust that kind of crowded moment more than any single clean feeling, because a man's true situation is almost always more than one thing at once. I felt relief, the plain animal relief of a man being lifted out of a danger he has not the strength to lift himself out of. I felt grief, real and sharp, at leaving the work and the line and the drowned who still came, and I felt rising under both, the pull, stronger for being cornered, the reasonable loving voice saying that the letter changed nothing, that a letter could not discharge a sacred charge, that I could refuse to go, could barricade myself in the tower, could make myself the thing the light could not do without, and that this would be, at last, my redemption. And I knew that voice now for what it was. I had read its name in the black book. It was not duty. It was the light drawing me down, and knowing it did not make it weaker. That is the thing no one tells you about seeing your own sickness clearly. It does not cure you. It only means you sin, if you sin, with your eyes open. But eyes open is not nothing. Eyes open is, I have come to think, most of what a soul is given to work with. I had from January to October then, and I spent it doing two things at once, which is a thing I had never in my life been able to do. And being able to do it at all was the whole measure of how the light had changed me, even as it tried to take me. The first thing I did was the work, as well as I have ever done it. Better, because I did it now, under sentence, knowing each night's crossing might be among the last I would ever witness, and there is a clarity in that. I saw them across, the regulars, the new ones, the last stragglers of the old 1843 dead. I kept the count. And I did it that final year without once trying to be the harbor, without a single clever story. with the pure, sustained presence the young man in the bow had taught me, and the black book had confirmed. And I was, God forgive the pride in it, good. I was finally good at the one thing I had been bad at my whole life, and it was too late to matter to anyone I had loved, and it mattered enormously to strangers who had been dead for 100 years. And I have made my peace with that arithmetic, because it is the arithmetic I was given. And the second thing I did, at the very same time, deliberately, against the grain, forcing myself the way you force a stiff hinge, was to keep the living window open. This was harder than any long night. I wrote to my daughter, really wrote to her. Not the careful reconciled Christmas note, but a true letter. And then another. And I told her some of what I have told you. The 8 feet of kitchen linoleum. The man I had been. Not to burden her, and not to be forgiven. Forgiveness was hers to give or withhold, and none of my business, but simply to be seen by her as I was. To be a window with a lamp in it turned toward my own child at last, asking nothing, only lit. She did not answer for a long time, and then she did. And it was not a reconciliation, nothing so tidy. It was cooler and more careful than the letters I sent. But it was real. It was a living voice looking back at me, needing me untidily and at the wrong times, disappointing me and being disappointed. And every letter of hers was a small, brutal victory over the light, because every time I turned toward my daughter, I was refusing to give the whole of myself to the dead. I was keeping one window of my heart faced across the water toward the living, exactly as the Black Book commanded. And I could feel the pull weaken by a degree each time. The way a fever breaks not all at once, but in falling stages you only notice looking back. I began watching the far window at Ardnamurach again. I made myself. At dusk, when it came on yellow across the 4 miles of cold water, I would stand at the seaward window of the house before I went up to the tower, and I would look at it, and I would think, living people at their supper who can look back, and I would let it be company again, and not accusation, and it was the hardest small discipline of my life, harder than the long night. To prefer even a little, even for a minute at dusk, the warm, difficult light of the living over the pure, easy light of the dead. And I got better at it. That is all I can claim. I did not become a whole man. I became a man who was practicing daily at the thing he was worst at, and kept practicing, and that, I have decided, is the most that is on offer to anyone. Now I come to the last of it, and to the choice, and I want to set it down exactly, because it is the reason I'm telling you any of this, and because it is not the choice you are expecting, and because it is the one thing I did in my whole life that I am without reservation proud of. As the autumn came on and the boat that would take me off drew nearer on the calendar, I understood that refusing to go was not the only form the light's pull could take, and that I had been watching for it in the wrong shape. I had been braced against the crude temptation to barricade myself in the tower, and that one I could refuse. I had read its name, but the light was subtler than that. What it offered me in the last weeks, in the reasonable, loving voice, was not that I stay in the flesh. It was that I stay in some other way, that I find, before I left, a means to keep witnessing the drowned after I was gone, that I not simply abandon them to the seeing machine that could not see. And this, I have to tell you, is a good desire. It is not the sickness. The drowned did need a witness, and there would be none after me, and that is a real grief and a real wrong. And a man who felt nothing at leaving them to it would be a monster. The trap was not in the grief. The trap was in the solution the light kept whispering, which was always, underneath its many reasonable forms, the same solution. Give yourself. Leave something of yourself behind at the window. Pour your attention into the light so that it goes on looking through you after you are gone. Become in some fashion the beam. And I understood at last, in the black loft with the book on my knees on a night in September, that a keeper could stay forever without ever refusing the boat. could cross the black water while his body rode away safe to the mainland. If in the end he gave the light the one thing it truly wanted, which was not his flesh, but his whole undivided love, offered up and left behind. And I would not. I want to say exactly what I did instead, because it is small and undramatic and it is everything. I did not try to solve the problem the light kept setting me. I did not find a way to leave my attention at the window. I did not sacrifice myself in any of the forms the pull offered, gross or subtle. What I did was refuse to be the harbor one last time, and for the largest stakes there were. I accepted that I could not save the drowned of Corran Head after I was gone. I accepted that the post was closing and that the machine could not see, and that souls would turn toward the light in the years to come and find the window dark, and that this was a real and terrible thing, and that it was not mine to fix. Because I am not the harbor. I am one window, one lamp, one man. And a man's whole life is not enough to fix the indifference of the sea. And the deepest sin of my life had always been the refusal to accept that limit, the insistence on being the one who could reconcile every column, close every account, land every soul, cross every 8 feet. And that insistence, worn now as a sacred vocation, was the last and largest form the light's pull could take. And I saw it, and I laid it down. But I did the one thing that was mine to do, that was within a single man's power. That did not require me to give myself up. I took the black book down out of the loft, and I did not leave it wedged behind a crate for the next keeper to find by accident, because there would be no next keeper. Instead, I sat down in the cold north office that smells of paraffin and stone, and I added my own hand to it, the last hand. And I wrote the true account, all of it, the circle and the count and the seeing, and the young man in the bow and the long night, and the mother and the child, and the pull and its name. And then I did the thing the trade had never done, the thing the book itself, passed hand to hand in secret in the dark loft, had never permitted. Because the trade kept its truth close and let each keeper learn it alone. I wrote it out fair, and I made a copy, and when the boat came in October, I took the copy off that rock with me, out into the living world, and I have done with it the only thing that serves both the dead and the living at once. I have told it. I am telling it now. Not so that some lonely man will read it and go out to the head and give his life to the light. God forbid it. That is the last thing I want. And if you have read this as an invitation, you have read it exactly backward, the way I once read everything backward. I am telling it so that the drowned of Corran Head, whom I could not go on witnessing and could not save from the dark that is coming for their window, are witnessed one last way, the only way left to me, by being known, by being spoken, by being in the mouth of one living man to whatever living ears will have them, not nothing. The mother and the child crossed together in the gray of a dawn in spring, and a man saw them, and now you know it. And that is a kind of light, too, a lamp in a different window, and it is the most I have. I live now on a dry inland street a long way from any sea. I line up the tins in the cupboard label out. Some things do not change and need not. But I answer my daughter's letters within the week, and when a person in front of me is in trouble, I have learned more often than not to hand them a plan, but to cross the room and sit down and be the lamp in the window while they do the crossing that is theirs alone, wanting nothing back. And I fail at it still, often. But I know now what I am failing at, which I did not before. And eyes open is most of what a soul is given to work with. I do not stand at windows at dusk waiting for lights to come on across cold water. I did enough of that. Sometimes, though, on the clear nights, I go out into my small dry garden and I look up. Not at any sea. There is no sea, only the ordinary dark over the ordinary town, and I think of the light still turning out there on the black rock at the end of the drowned spit, honest and blind, flashing its 15 seconds white for ships that mostly have radar now and hardly need it. And I think of the beam going around and coming to the black water landward and north, and doing it slow, heavy looking over the place where the boats come, and finding no one in the high room, finding the window dark. And I feel the grief of that, fully, without turning away from it and without trying to fix it. Because I have learned that you can hold a grief you cannot mend, that this is in fact the whole of what it means to be present to another's trouble. To sit in the open weather of it, wanting nothing and offering nothing, and simply refusing to leave. And I do that for them from a garden 100 miles inland, which is absurd, and which is the truest prayer I have ever been able to make. The light was never meant for the ships. I know that now. And so do you. It was meant for the ones the sea took mid-passage and never gave back, so that at the end of the cold, dark water there would be, for each of them, one lit window and one pair of living eyes to say, "I see you. You are not nothing. You have arrived." I got to be those eyes for a little while. It was the only thing I was ever good at that mattered. And I came to it 40 years too late for everyone I owed it to. And I did it anyway, for strangers. And then I laid it down and walked away while I still could. And both of those, the doing and the laying down, were the same act of love. And I did not understand that until now, saying it to you, in the ordinary dark, a long way from the sea. That is the whole of it. The count tonight, out there on the rock, will be 0, because there is no one to make it anything else. I am sorry for that, and I cannot help it. And I have stopped believing that being sorry for a thing you cannot help is the same as being guilty of it. That is the last thing the light taught me, and it is the thing I most needed. And I will end there, because it is true. And a man who has told the truth should know when to stop.